Depending on where you live, let's say, for example, the northeastern United States, you know that some birds are definitely migratory. They live in your area during summer and then they migrate south in autumn, and zero live in your area during the winter. Then there might be other birds which are commonly seen during the winter. So you may see, chickadees or goldfinches or cardinals at your bird feeder all throughout the winter and conclude that they are not migrating. And you may look at maps in your bird guide and say, oh, here's the migratory route. So migration is rather simple. Birds migrate or they don't, and here is the map of where they spend their summer, their winter, and their migratory route between. However, you may notice that the number of, say, great blue herons or bald eagles that you find in your area might vary. In a warm winter where not all water freezes over, you might actually see some throughout the winter, while in a cold winter, they may be harder to find or you may not see them at all. You may wait for short-eared owls to migrate from their northern range into your area over winter. But in a milder winter, perhaps not as many migrate south, and you don't see as many in your area over winter because they can still find prey up north. So unfortunately, nature is a bit more complicated, and there is something known as partial migration, where there can be variations observed in migratory behavior, say, of birds. So for example, if you were to ask, does the eastern bluebird migrate? The answer might depend on where in its range, which stretches from Canada throughout the eastern US, but then even into Mexico and Central America, where in its range you are talking about. Bluebird number one, living in the south of its range, might not migrate at all and remain in its breeding area all year round. Bluebird number two, living in the south of its range, might migrate but only a short distance from its breeding area. Bluebird number three might live in the north of its range and migrate into the southern part of its range where other bluebirds are living all year round, while bluebird number four, living in the north of its range, might migrate into this area in yellow, which is an area where one can find wintering eastern bluebirds, but this is not an area where they breed in summer. In the northern regions of its breeding range, there might be some variation where some bluebirds migrate and some don't. It is known that there are examples where genetic variants determine whether an animal is likely to migrate or not. This is known in some mammals such as caribou, some fish such as salmon, and some birds such as the blackcap, which is a European warbler. And so depending on which allele of a specific gene a bird has, it is more likely or less likely to migrate. And then there are examples, for example, the white-winged snowfinch, where it is not genes but environmental cues which will cause differences in whether a bird will migrate or not. If some individuals are migrating and others not, this may be a flexible choice. So for example, the individuals which migrate one year might choose not to migrate another year. This is known in American house finches and skylarks. While in other species, it seems to be consistent in an individual's choice, so that those who do not migrate tend always to choose not to migrate, such as in crows, red-tailed hawks, and red-shouldered hawks. The decision to migrate or not might depend on some characteristic of the individuals, such as the larger individuals might choose not to migrate and the smaller ones do, or there may be a gender difference, or those that are more dominant. So for example, if they are defending a territory, they might be more likely to stay in it and not migrate. In house finches and skylarks, larger individuals are more likely to be resident in the breeding grounds all throughout the year, perhaps because larger body size protects them from the cold or reduced food supplies. There might be variations in the timing of the migration and it might be delayed. For example, temperature, as is known in the goldeneye, or in the availability of food in a good crop year, as in a relative of the cedar waxwing. This might cause migration to occur, but be delayed. Migration might occur, but the birds might not travel as far as they otherwise would. This is known as short stopping, and the term was first used in 1967 to describe the migration of Canada geese. Migration might not, in essence, be one thing but two, occurring in two phases. And perhaps the decision to migrate, say from the northern regions of the range, is an obligatory one where all members of the population decide to migrate, but that once they start migration, that there is a secondary phase where they will go from one region then to, say, the southern extreme of their migratory route, but that this decision is then based on factors such as food availability or temperature. And this is known in yellow-rumped warblers and the American tree sparrow. If it is observed that a bird's migratory route is changing over the years, this might not actually be because of migration per se, but because a bird's entire range is shifting due to human caused changes such as climate change. So, for example, if the birds are simply moving farther north in their range, then perhaps the migratory route changes as well. Changing climate and changing habitats can certainly affect birds and their success during migration. For example, if a climate becomes warmer, this would cause a shift in the bud break of plants when plants first start to make their leaves, which could cause a shift in the insect hatching. The insects are trying to time their hatching to the bud break, and birds often feed on these insects during migration. The long distance migrants, which are sometimes called neotropical migrants, they are at a disadvantage. While a bird which winters in the southern US would be able to perceive a warming climate in the eastern US and perhaps modify its migration to this change, those which are overwintering in Central or South America would not perceive this change. And when they migrate, they would have missed the window of insect availability to which their migration had formerly been tied. This could then affect how well they are able to feed during migration, and thus perhaps how many eggs that will be able to be laid when they reach their breeding grounds. In a species where some overwinter, say, in Florida and others in South America, those overwintering in Florida might have an advantage. These variations in migration can be acted on by natural selection since they can affect who lives versus who dies and who mates and passes on their genes. For example, individuals who migrate may have an advantage in a harsh winter because those who do not migrate are more likely to die because of cold. However, in a milder winter, those that do not migrate will not lose all of the energy that would be expended during migration, may establish a territory earlier in the season, and thus may mate more. Thus, migration is complicated. It is not simply just an issue of whether birds migrate or no, because there are a number of variations known as partial migration.